"Can I clean your house for a plate of food?" But when the billionaire saw her, he froze. The wind cut sharp through the narrow alleys of Beacon Hill as the late afternoon sun dipped below the Boston skyline. Emma Collins stood at the edge of the sidewalk, staring up at a wrought iron gate that marked the entrance to a grand estate, an architectural monument nestled between historic townhouses and modern glass towers. Her coat, 3 winters too old and 1 size too small, did little to guard against the chill. Her shoes were thin-soled and soaked from the snowmelt that trickled down the sloping streets. But her hunger was worse than the cold. Her pride, long bruised and finally surrendered, had brought her here. She stepped forward. A security guard stood behind the gate, mid-50s, stocky, wearing a navy blue jacket with a golden crest on the shoulder. He looked up from his clipboard, clearly surprised by the sight of a young woman with a worn backpack and downcast eyes. "Miss?" he asked, cautious but not unkind. Emma swallowed hard. Her throat was dry, her voice hoarse from the wind. I was wondering if," she hesitated, looking past him at the house that loomed beyond the hedge-lined path. "If I could clean your house in exchange for a plate of food. Just something warm. I'm not asking for money. Just something to eat." The guard raised an eyebrow, glancing at the camera above the gate. "I'm not a thief," she added quickly. "I can work. I used to clean offices. I'll scrub floors, wash dishes, anything. Please." For a moment, there was silence. Her breath clouded in the cold air as she waited, trembling. Then the guard pressed a button on his headset and murmured something she couldn't hear. He gave her another long look, then nodded slowly. "Wait here." Emma nodded, wrapping her arms tighter around herself as the wind whipped harder. Minutes passed like hours. She stared down at her cracked fingernails, wondering if she'd gone too far. But she couldn't turn back. The last meal she'd had was a bowl of rice 3 nights ago at the shelter, and even that felt like a luxury now. The gate creaked. She looked up. The man who stepped out onto the path was tall, dressed in dark slacks and a gray cashmere sweater, his presence commanding in a way that made the air shift. His black hair was speckled with silver at the temples, neatly combed back. His face was unreadable at first glance, sharp jawline, deep-set hazel eyes, but when he saw her, he stopped. Dead still. His gaze locked onto her face with such intensity that Emma instinctively stepped back. The guard beside him noticed. "Mr. Reed," she said she'd clean for food. "Just thought I'd ask you before turning her away." Mr. Reed didn't respond. He was frozen. Emma opened her mouth to speak, unsure whether to apologize or explain again, but something in his expression made her hesitate. His face had gone pale. His eyes were wide, not with suspicion or contempt, but with something else. Recognition? Fear? Finally, he stepped forward. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice low but steady. "Emma," she said. "Emma Collins." He took another step, then stopped. His eyes flickered, as if he were doing math in his head. There was a long silence. He nodded once. "Come in." Emma blinked. "Really?" "Yes. You can eat. And rest. And if you want to clean, you can. But first, come inside." The guard shot him a puzzled look, but didn't argue. Emma followed Mr. Reed through the gate and down the flagstone path, her boots clicking faintly against the stones. The house was even more imposing up close, red brick with white columns, the windows tall and framed by dark green shutters. Inside, the foyer was warm and filled with the faint scent of cedarwood and citrus polish. Her fingers tingled as the heat began to thaw them. He led her through the hall without speaking, stopping near a side door that led to a small kitchen nook. "You're cold," he said. "And hungry." She nodded. He opened the fridge, pulled out a container, and began heating something on the stove. He didn't call for a chef or a maid. He did it himself. She sat, awkward, at the edge of a stool, unsure if this was a dream or some strange setup for disappointment. "You can shower after you eat," he said without looking at her. There are spare clothes upstairs. I'll have someone bring them. Thank you, she whispered. He turned, a bowl in his hands, steam rising from the soup inside. He placed it in front of her, along with a thick slice of bread and a glass of water. Emma's hands shook as she picked up the spoon. He watched her eat, silent. Not like he was being cautious. More like he was trying to remember something. Or someone. Emma didn't remember the last time a bowl of soup had tasted so rich or made her feel so conflicted. The warmth that spread through her chest had as much to do with the food as with the sudden shift in her situation. She was inside a mansion that seemed to have stepped out of a magazine, eating something she couldn't have afforded even on her best days. The man who had let her in, Nathaniel Reed, she had overheard the guard call him, was unlike anyone she had ever encountered. Not just because of his wealth, but because of the way he looked at her. As if she were more than just another stranger in need. She kept her eyes on the soup, aware of his presence still lingering at the edge of the kitchen. He hadn't sat down. He hadn't asked her much beyond her name. But the silence between them wasn't the kind that pushed her away. It was heavy, like something unspoken sat in the room with them, waiting. When she finished, Emma pushed the bowl away gently. Thank you, she said again, quieter this time. Nathaniel gave the smallest nod and stepped forward. There's a guest room down the hall. It has its own bathroom. You'll find fresh towels in the cabinet. I've asked Martha to bring some clothes. Emma rose, brushing her hands on her jeans. I don't want to be a burden. I really can work, I wasn't just saying that. I believe you, he said, but his voice held something else, uncertainty? Regret? Whatever it was, he didn't elaborate. Get some rest. We'll talk tomorrow. He turned and walked away before she could say anything else. The room she found at the end of the hall was almost too much to take in. Cream-colored walls, soft lighting, a bed that looked like it could swallow her whole. The bathroom was just as elegant. As the hot water rushed over her in the shower, Emma closed her eyes and let herself breathe, just for a moment. Not because everything was okay, it wasn't. She was still technically homeless, still jobless, and she had no idea why this man had brought her inside. But for now, she wasn't freezing. And she wasn't alone. Later, dressed in a soft knit sweater and leggings that smelled faintly of lavender detergent, Emma stood by the window of the guest room, looking out at the garden below. The house was so quiet, yet there was movement somewhere. Shadows under the door. Footsteps in the hall. She knew she shouldn't be snooping, but curiosity had always been her downfall. She crept out of the room, barefoot, and wandered down the hall. The house was a maze of polished floors and silent rooms. Then she heard it, the soft creak of a door. She followed the sound until she reached a partially open door near the end of the second floor. Through the gap, she could see Nathaniel inside what looked like a study. He was sitting behind a desk, leaning forward, holding something in his hands. She pushed the door slightly, just enough to see more clearly. It was a photograph. Old, maybe decades old. Faded edges, curled from time. He held it as if it were something sacred. Emma took a step back. She shouldn't be watching. But as she turned to leave, the floorboard under her foot gave a soft groan. The sound was quiet, but not quiet enough. Nathaniel looked up sharply. His eyes locked with hers through the crack in the door. She froze. Emma, he said, his voice calm but unmistakably alert. She stepped fully into view, hands up slightly in apology. I wasn't spying. I just got lost. I heard a sound. He didn't seem angry. Just tired. He gestured for her to come in. She stepped into the study. It was dim, lit by a green-shaded desk lamp. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books and framed awards. There was an old record player in one corner, a globe bar near the window. On the desk sat a crystal decanter with untouched whiskey. You couldn't sleep? He asked, placing the photograph face down. Not really. Too quiet, she said, offering a faint smile. Nathaniel nodded once, as if that made perfect sense. Some people find silence comforting. Others find it unbearable. Guess I'm the second kind. He studied her, his eyes flicking over her face, not with judgment, but with something else. Something deeper. Then he said, slowly, "You remind me of someone." Emma didn't answer. "I wasn't expecting any of this," he continued. "It's not every day someone knocks on my gate offering to clean in exchange for food." She lowered her gaze. "I didn't know what else to do. I'm not criticizing. You're braver than most people I know." Silence stretched again. Emma's eyes drifted to the photograph, now face down. Her curiosity won. "Was that her?" she asked quietly. "The person I remind you of?" Nathaniel hesitated, then turned the photo over and handed it to her. Emma took it carefully. The photo was old, as she had thought, and in it stood a woman with long dark hair, laughing in mid-turn as if caught between words. She was beautiful. Free-spirited. Alive. The resemblance was undeniable. Emma looked up. "She looks like me." Nathaniel nodded. Her name was Clara. Emma held the photo closer. "She was someone close to you?" "She was everything," he said softly. "We were engaged. She died a long time ago." Emma wanted to ask how. But something in his voice made her stop. The weight of that word, died, was enough. Whatever had happened, it had carved something deep into this man's life. "She was an artist," he added. "Painted in oil, mostly. Landscapes, portraits. She had this wild way of seeing the world. Said that beauty wasn't in what was there, but in how we chose to look at it." Emma smiled faintly. "She sounds like someone worth remembering." "I never forgot her," he said. Then, looking at her again, "And tonight, when I saw you, I thought for a moment I was seeing her ghost." Emma handed the photo back gently. "I'm not a ghost," she said. "No," he replied. "You're something else." A silence fell between them again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Just complicated. Nathaniel stood. "It's late. You should rest. Tomorrow, if you still want to help around the house, you can. But you're not expected to. You're not here because I need a maid." Emma tilted her head. "Then why am I here?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he picked up the photograph and stared at it a moment longer. Maybe because fate doesn't knock twice. And sometimes, we don't realize what we've lost until it appears in another form. He gave her a small nod, then turned toward the door. Emma followed him out into the hall, the warmth of the house suddenly feeling strange against her skin. Not threatening, but unfamiliar. Like walking into a life that wasn't hers, yet felt oddly close. She returned to the guest room, but sleep didn't come easily. Down the hall, behind the study door, Nathaniel sat alone, the photo still in his hands, and the question echoing in his mind, could this girl, this stranger at his gate, really be connected to the woman he had loved and lost a quarter of a century ago? The sun rose quietly over Boston, casting a pale golden hue over the city's colonial rooftops. In the Reed mansion, the stillness of the morning gave way to the soft movements of staff preparing breakfast and tending to the garden just beyond the tall windows. But Nathaniel Reed was already awake, seated once again in his study, the photograph of Clara resting on the desk beside him. He hadn't slept. After Emma returned to the guest room the night before, he had paced the floor, opened old drawers, and unlocked a safe that hadn't been touched in years. Inside were remnants of a life he had buried, a leather-bound journal filled with Clara's sketches, a bundle of love letters tied with a satin ribbon, and a stack of newspaper clippings about the accident. He hadn't looked at any of it in more than a decade. He spread the items across the desk, searching not just for answers but for patterns. Emma's face, so similar to Clara's, it wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. Downstairs, Emma stood hesitantly at the kitchen entrance. Martha, a housekeeper with graying hair and a firm jawline, acknowledged her with a glance but said nothing. On the island counter sat a spread of breakfast foods, eggs, fruit, toast, and coffee, but Emma didn't move toward it. "Good morning," she said softly. Martha didn't smile. "Mr. Reed is in his study." Emma nodded, feeling like an intruder again. She poured herself a glass of water and sat quietly, trying not to appear out of place. After a few minutes, she stood and wandered through the house, drawn by the urge to understand where she had found herself. She ended up in the gallery room. Floor-to-ceiling windows cast light across a collection of paintings displayed with museum-level precision. Landscapes of the Massachusetts countryside, abstract compositions in warm tones, and portraits, all signed with the name Clara M. Elridge. Emma stood in front of one in particular, a painting of a woman standing at the edge of a lake, her back to the viewer, hair swept by the wind. There was something haunting about it. Behind her, a voice spoke. She painted that 6 months before she died. Emma turned. Nathaniel stood in the doorway, arms crossed loosely, his expression unreadable. "I didn't mean to pry," she said quickly. "You're not," he replied, stepping further into the room. She wanted people to see her work. Said paintings weren't meant to be hidden. Emma looked at the painting again. She had talent. She had more than that, Nathaniel said. She had vision. She could look at someone once and see their entire story. That was her real gift. Emma nodded, her eyes still on the brushstrokes. "I think that's rare." Nathaniel studied her a moment longer. "Emma, may I ask you something personal?" She turned to him. "Sure. Do you know anything about your birth parents?" The question struck like a silent chord. She lowered her gaze. "Not much. I was adopted when I was a baby. All I know is I came from Massachusetts. My foster parents never told me anything else. And the records were always sealed." Nathaniel stepped closer, voice gentle. "Did you ever try to find out?" "I did. But it led nowhere. I even went back to one of the shelters I stayed at years ago, but the files were gone. Burned in some storage accident, they said." She paused, then added, "Sometimes I think they were never real in the first place." Nathaniel didn't speak right away. He took a long breath, then gestured toward a nearby chair. "Would you sit with me for a moment?" Emma hesitated, then followed him to a small sitting area near the fireplace. He picked up a thick envelope from the side table and handed it to her. "What's this?" she asked. "Clara's journal." Emma blinked. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because there's something in there you should see." She opened the envelope slowly, pulling out the leather-bound book. The pages were filled with sketches, mostly of flowers, buildings, and faces. On one page, Clara had drawn a baby girl, wrapped in a blanket, with a tiny handwritten caption underneath, "My little miracle, August 12, 2000. Emma's hands trembled. "That's your birthday," Nathaniel said softly. She looked up at him, stunned. "How do you know that?" "Because Clara told me, years ago. Before she disappeared, she told me she was pregnant. I didn't know what happened after. I thought she had lost the baby, or changed her mind and left. And then she died. But now..." Emma closed the journal, her thoughts racing. "Are you saying Clara was my mother?" "I don't know for certain. But the resemblance, the timing, this drawing. It can't all be coincidence." Emma sat back, her body numb. The room seemed to spin slightly, as if her foundation had shifted beneath her feet. For years she had imagined her birth mother as a shadow, someone who had left her behind without a second thought. But now she was being told that maybe, just maybe, her mother had loved her. Had drawn her. Had named her Miracle. She whispered, "Why wouldn't anyone have told me this?" Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "That's what I intend to find out." Later that day, while Emma tried to process what she had learned, Nathaniel made a series of calls from his office. Old contacts, former employees, anyone who might have known Clara's whereabouts in the final months of her life. One name came up more than once, Walter Grant, his former business partner. Walter had known Clara well. Too well. And he had been the last to see her alive, aside from the coroner. Nathaniel remembered the strange way Walter had spoken of her at the funeral, how quickly he had insisted on moving on, closing down Clara's studio, settling her affairs. Nathaniel hadn't questioned it then. He was too grief-stricken. But now the doubts were returning. That evening, Emma sat in the library with the journal open on her lap. She flipped through more pages, finding a sketch of a small house by the ocean, labeled, "Where We'll Raise Her." A few pages later, a half-finished letter addressed to Nate. She read it aloud quietly. "If something happens to me, please don't forget her. She's the best part of me. Keep her safe." Emma closed the book, her eyes burning. She wasn't just a girl with no past anymore. She had a name that had once been spoken with love. She had a mother who had tried to protect her. And now, she had a man who might be the only one willing to uncover the truth. As night fell over Boston again, Emma stood by the window of her guest room, staring out at the garden below. But this time, she didn't feel like a guest. She felt like someone who had been found. 2 days had passed since Emma held Clara's journal in her hands. Though the pages said little outright, they had spoken volumes to her heart. There was still no proof beyond drawings and whispered memories, but something inside her had shifted. The questions she had carried for years had found direction, even if the answers were still painfully out of reach. Nathaniel had become quieter since then. Not distant, exactly, but contemplative. He seemed careful with his words, as if trying to balance what he felt with what he feared. And Emma had found herself walking a similar line. Each step she took in that house felt heavier than the last, not out of discomfort, but because the walls themselves seemed to carry history that might soon belong to her. That morning, she dressed early and began dusting the baseboards in the hallway, not because anyone asked her to, but because movement helped settle her nerves. The mansion was massive, and no matter how much time she spent in it, it never felt fully familiar. Each door opened to another part of someone else's life, a life she wasn't sure she had any right to be part of. As she reached the end of the corridor, she heard footsteps approaching briskly from the east wing. A woman appeared, tall and lean, with auburn hair pinned into a neat twist and a clipboard tucked under one arm. Her heels clicked on the marble floor with the precision of someone used to authority. Her eyes, sharp and measuring, landed on Emma with immediate suspicion. "You must be the guest," she said, the word guest weighted with implication. Emma stood, wiping her hands on her jeans. "I'm Emma." "I know who you are," the woman replied. "Susan Morgan. I manage this household." Emma offered a hand, but Susan didn't take it. Instead, she walked past her and looked critically at the cloth in Emma's hand. "Housekeeping is not your responsibility," Susan said flatly. "We have a staff for that." "I don't mind helping," Emma said, trying to keep her tone neutral. "It gives me something to do." Susan didn't respond. She simply stared at Emma, the silence thick. "Is something wrong?" Emma asked after a beat. Susan's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Reed has never taken in strangers off the street before. Certainly not ones he lets wander the halls unaccompanied." Emma stiffened. "I didn't mean to overstep." "Didn't you?" Susan walked to the window and looked out over the garden. "This house runs on routine, Miss Collins. Every person here has a role and boundaries. You seem uncertain of both." Emma didn't reply. She felt the flush rising in her cheeks, part embarrassment, part anger. She didn't owe this woman explanations, not yet, at least. Susan continued. "Whatever you and Mr. Reed are discussing, I suggest you manage it without disrupting the rest of this household." "I'm not trying to disrupt anything," Emma said quietly. "I'm just trying to understand where I came from." Susan turned sharply. "Be careful what you look for. Some truths are better left buried." With that, she walked away, her heels echoing long after she was gone. Emma stood alone in the hallway, the weight of the exchange pressing into her chest. There had been no subtlety in Susan's tone, only warning. And something more, fear. That was what Emma had sensed most. Fear that she would uncover something Susan didn't want her to find. Later that day, Emma took a walk through the garden, needing fresh air and space. The autumn air had turned crisp, and the trees along the perimeter had started to shed their leaves, blanketing the path in amber and gold. As she moved toward the far edge of the estate, she noticed a small gate, slightly ajar, leading into what looked like an old greenhouse. Curious, she stepped inside. Dust floated through the filtered light, and long-forgotten vines curled around broken pots and rusted tools. The place had been untouched for years. At the far end, beneath a cracked window, stood an easel with a half-finished canvas, more weathered than destroyed. It showed the outline of a young woman's face, half-formed, the eyes incomplete. Emma ran her fingers lightly over the edge of the frame. Whoever had started the painting hadn't finished it. She could almost hear the quiet scrape of a brush, the way the light might have come through the glass when the room was still alive. Behind her, a voice interrupted the silence. She used to come here when she needed to think. Emma turned to see Nathaniel standing at the door, hands in his coat pockets. "Clara?" she asked. He nodded. This was her sanctuary. Emma looked back at the painting. Did she paint this? Nathaniel stepped forward, studying the canvas. She started it the month before the accident. Said it was supposed to be a portrait of our daughter. Emma's breath caught. I didn't know until much later that she had been working on it. Susan found it after the funeral and stored it here. He glanced at Emma. I haven't been back since. Emma frowned. Susan found it? Yes. She was Clara's assistant before she began managing the estate. Emma felt a chill pass through her. Susan, who had just warned her to stop digging, had been trusted enough to handle Clara's belongings. And she had hidden this? I think Susan knows more than she's letting on, Emma said carefully. Nathaniel exhaled. I've started to suspect the same. That night, Emma returned to her room to find her backpack unzipped and its contents strewn across the bed. Her notebook, her ID, the small locket she had carried since she was 12, all laid out as if inspected. Her breath quickened. She was sure she had zipped the bag before leaving. She stepped back into the hallway and scanned for signs of anyone nearby. The corridor was empty. But under her door, wedged into the frame, was a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it slowly. It read, in block letters, "You do not belong here. Leave before it's too late." Her hands trembled. She looked around again, but the house remained still, silent. Whoever had been in her room was long gone. Emma sat on the bed, heart pounding. The message was clear, and it wasn't just from someone who didn't like her presence. It was from someone who feared what she might uncover. She picked up the locket from the bed and opened it. Inside was a photo so small it was almost worn smooth, just the face of a young woman holding a baby. Emma had never known who the woman was. The adoption agency never said. But now, looking at it again, she saw the shape of the woman's nose, the curve of her lips, and for the first time, the resemblance felt real. Not imagined. Real. She closed the locket and clutched it tight. There were walls closing in around her, yes. But there were also doors. And she wasn't going to leave without opening every last one. Emma barely slept that night. The note left in her room still echoed in her thoughts, and the image of her belongings scattered across the bed haunted her long after the lights were out. For years she had faced the fear of not knowing who she was. Now that she was finally getting closer to the truth, someone in that house was trying to stop her. But that only made her more determined. The next morning, she rose before the sun and made her way quietly through the house, avoiding Susan and anyone else who might question her presence. Something about the greenhouse painting had stayed with her, not just the image, but the fact that Susan had hidden it for so many years. It was as if Clara had been erased intentionally, kept out of sight, along with every clue that might connect Emma to her. She found herself back in the gallery room, the one filled with Clara's finished works. Most were carefully labeled with plaques, titles, years, mediums. But something she hadn't noticed before now caught her eye. On the lower shelf of a glass cabinet stood a small photograph framed in bronze, not a painting. Emma leaned closer. It was Clara, unmistakably younger, standing beside a man Emma didn't recognize. But it wasn't Nathaniel. She turned and left quickly, the photo still burning in her memory. She needed answers, and she could no longer rely solely on Nathaniel's memories. If she was to find the truth, she had to start connecting the pieces herself. Later that morning, while Nathaniel was out on a call and Susan was occupied with staff, Emma slipped into the west wing of the house, a part she hadn't explored before. Most doors were locked or unused, storage rooms or closed-off guest quarters. But at the end of the hall, she found a small study that appeared untouched for years. Dust coated the desk, but the filing cabinet in the corner showed signs of recent use. She knelt down and began pulling open the drawers. Most were filled with estate records, tax documents, and donation letters, but one folder tucked at the back caught her attention. It was unlabeled, but inside were several photographs, receipts, and a small collection of handwritten notes. One of the notes was signed, CME. Clara Margaret Elridge. Emma unfolded it carefully. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. Walter is pressuring me to change the terms of the trust. He says the child will complicate things, that Nate can't be distracted. I don't trust him anymore. Emma's stomach turned. Walter. The name had come up in one of Nathaniel's calls earlier that week. He had been Nathaniel's business partner. If Clara had written this about him, and if it was truly about the child, about her, then Walter had known about her existence from the beginning. And he had tried to erase her. She stuffed the folder under her coat and left the room, locking it again behind her. Her mind raced with thoughts. If Clara had feared Walter, and Walter had control over any aspect of Clara's estate, then maybe the reason Emma had been hidden was more sinister than anyone had suspected. Nathaniel returned later that afternoon. Emma waited for the right moment and then approached him in the library. I need to show you something, she said quietly. He looked up from his book, concerned. What is it? She handed him the note. His eyes scanned the page, his jaw tightening with every word. Where did you find this? In a study. Back wing. It looks like Susan had been using the room. Nathaniel stood abruptly. I should have looked harder. I should have checked every damn room in this house years ago. Emma watched him, unsure what to say. He turned back to her. I trusted Walter. I trusted Susan. They both told me Clara died before the baby was born. That she had gone to the hospital alone and didn't make it. I never saw a birth certificate. I never saw a grave. I believed what they told me because I didn't want to face the possibility that she had left me. Emma nodded slowly. But she didn't. No, he said. She was trying to protect you. That night, Nathaniel called his legal advisor and requested copies of all the original trust documents Clara had established. While they waited for the files to arrive, he and Emma reviewed the photographs from the study. One in particular showed Clara standing outside a small white building, an old orphanage with a rusted sign reading, Bayview Home for Children. Emma stared at the image. I think I've seen this place before. I think that's where I was. Nathaniel didn't hesitate. Then we're going. They drove the next morning, just after dawn, heading south along the coast. The roads grew quieter, older, more rural as they approached the town where the orphanage had once operated. When they arrived, the building was barely standing. Shutters dangled off hinges. The sign was half gone. But inside, one room had been converted into a records office. A woman in her 60s sat at the front desk, wearing thick glasses and a name tag that read, Linda. We're looking for records, Nathaniel said. From 24 years ago. A child named Emma Collins. Linda shook her head. Most of the paper records from that time were moved into storage, or destroyed after the storm in '06. Emma felt her hope fading. But, Linda continued, we did digitize a few documents. Let me check. She disappeared into the back. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. Nathaniel paced the floor, unable to hide his tension. Minutes passed. When Linda returned, she held a printed page in her hand. "I found this," she said. "It's an intake form. No official birth certificate attached, but there is a note in the margin, private placement. Paid by W.G." Emma leaned over. "W.G.? Walter Grant?" Nathaniel cursed under his breath. Linda looked between them, confused. "He was listed as a family liaison, whatever that meant back then." Emma whispered, "He paid to have me placed here." Nathaniel nodded grimly. "And probably to keep it quiet." On the way back to Boston, neither of them spoke much. The pieces were falling into place, and with each revelation, the picture became clearer. Clara hadn't just been silenced. She had been deliberately erased. Walter Grant had intervened at the most vulnerable moment of her life, had hidden her child, and had lied to everyone involved. That evening, back in the mansion, Emma returned to the gallery one last time. She stared at the paintings again, but now they meant something different. They weren't just remnants of an artist's legacy, they were fragments of a life stolen from her. Each brushstroke was a whisper of the mother she never knew, the woman who had tried to protect her in the only way she could. And Emma was ready to fight for what was left. The rain started just after midnight. It pattered softly against the windows of the Reed estate, a rhythmic tapping that filled the empty hallways and darkened corridors. Emma lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, unable to rest. The revelations of the past days had uprooted every certainty she had built to survive. Clara had loved her. Had wanted her. Walter had ensured she disappeared. And now, someone in this house was trying to make her vanish again. The note, the ransacked room, the silent threats, they weren't random. They were personal. Emma sat up, her thoughts circling back to Susan. There was something about the woman's disdain that went beyond professionalism. It was control, territorial, strategic. But Emma didn't believe she was working alone. If Walter had orchestrated a cover-up 24 years ago, someone had helped him from within. And Susan had been here the whole time. Emma stood and stepped to the window, parting the curtains just enough to look outside. The garden was cloaked in darkness, trees swaying slightly in the wind. But near the west hedge, movement caught her eye, a figure in a long coat moving across the lawn, a flashlight flickering briefly. She narrowed her eyes. It wasn't Nathaniel. It wasn't any of the regular staff, who were already off duty for the night. She didn't hesitate. Pulling on a sweatshirt and boots, Emma crept out of the room and down the service stairwell. The house was quiet. She moved through the kitchen, past the unused pantry, and slipped through the side door. The cold air hit her immediately, sharp and damp. The rain had become a mist, and the garden smelled of wet earth and lavender. She followed the direction of the figure, moving along the stone path, her breath shallow. Near the old greenhouse, she stopped. The door was ajar. She pushed it open slowly. Inside, the air was thick with moisture and the scent of rotting wood. At first, she saw nothing. But then, near the old easel where Clara's unfinished portrait still stood, a man was kneeling, gloved hands pulling up the floorboards. Emma froze. The man turned suddenly, startled by the creak of the door. His face was half covered by a black scarf, but the eyes were unmistakable. It was one of the estate's groundskeepers. Robert. Emma had seen him several times over the past week, usually quiet, respectful, unassuming. She never suspected anything. But now, caught in the act of tearing through a place Clara once considered sacred, he looked like a cornered animal. "What are you doing?" she asked, voice sharper than she expected. Robert stood, dropping the crowbar in his hand. "You shouldn't be here. You work for her, don't you?" Emma took a step forward. "For Susan. Or for Walter. Who sent you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he lunged toward her. Emma stumbled back, her shoulder hitting the side of the greenhouse frame. She reached for anything, grabbing a rusted shovel leaning nearby and raising it instinctively. Robert stopped, just inches away, eyes flicking to the tool in her hands. "You don't understand what you're getting into," he hissed. "You were never supposed to come back." "I didn't come back," she said through gritted teeth. "I was taken." Robert's lip curled, but before he could say anything more, a voice rang out behind them. "Let go of her." Nathaniel stood in the greenhouse doorway, a flashlight aimed directly at Robert's face. Behind him, 2 more staff members approached quickly, one holding a phone. Robert turned, hesitated, and then bolted past them into the night. Emma dropped the shovel, her knees trembling. Nathaniel crossed the room in seconds. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. "No." But he was digging something up. Under the floor. One of the staff members knelt and pried the remaining boards loose. Beneath them was a metal lockbox, caked in dirt and rust. Nathaniel crouched beside it, hands steady as he lifted it out. "Help me take this inside." Back in the study, they laid the box on a towel and forced it open. Inside were several aged documents, some wrapped in a plastic sheet, along with a velvet pouch. Emma reached for the papers while Nathaniel opened the pouch. The documents were letters, several addressed to Nate, written in Clara's careful handwriting. Most were unfinished, as if she had written them in moments of panic or doubt. One was a medical record from a small private clinic, confirming Clara's pregnancy and expected due date. Another was a handwritten will, unnotarized but dated and signed. It read, "If anything happens to me before the baby is born, I want Nathaniel Reed to have full custody. The child is ours. I fear I won't be allowed to carry her safely if Walter continues to interfere. He says it's for the company, but I know better. I fear for us both." Emma stared at the signature, her chest tight. Nathaniel looked up from the pouch. Inside were Clara's earrings, a necklace, and a single photograph, Clara holding a newborn baby wrapped in a blue and white blanket. The child's eyes were shut, but the resemblance was again undeniable. "It's you," he whispered. Emma reached for the photo with trembling hands. "They lied to everyone," she said. "Walter, Susan, they buried all of this." Nathaniel nodded. "And someone was willing to do it again." He stood. "We need to bring this to the board. If Walter manipulated Clara's will, if he hid this child from everyone, and if Susan helped him maintain that lie, then we have legal grounds to reopen everything." Emma stepped back. "Are you sure they won't destroy the evidence?" "Not if we move fast." But the next morning, when Nathaniel called for Susan to attend a staff meeting and present the documents to the family attorney, she was nowhere to be found. Her room was empty. Her office had been cleared. And on her desk, a note remained, typed, unsigned. "You went too far. Now you've left us no choice." Emma stared at the paper. "She's running. Or preparing for something worse," Nathaniel said. "This is no longer just about inheritance or reputation. This is about control." Emma swallowed hard. "And what if they're still watching us?" Nathaniel looked at her, voice calm but resolute. "Then let them watch. But they should know this time, they're not erasing you. Not again." The atmosphere in the mansion had changed. Gone was the measured calm of a well-managed estate. In its place, tension hummed through the halls like a distant alarm, silent but constant. Staff spoke in whispers. Doors that were once left open were now closed. Every sound, a footstep on the staircase, a drawer opening, felt amplified, suspicious. Emma moved carefully through the house, feeling the walls tighten around her. Though Susan had disappeared without a trace, her presence lingered. It was in the missing files, in the abruptly deleted digital records, in the absence of answers from staff who claimed to know nothing. Someone had gone to great lengths to protect Walter Grant's secrets, and the damage was far from done. Nathaniel had spent the past 48 hours in near-constant meetings with legal advisors and members of the company board. He wanted to bring the truth forward. But truth, as Emma was learning, was never enough on its own. It had to be proven. And the people who had buried it were powerful enough to make the evidence vanish, if they hadn't already. Emma found herself alone in the library that afternoon, seated in a high-backed chair with Clara's journal open on her lap. She wasn't reading anymore. She was staring at the same page for the 10th time. The sketch of the baby. The name written in the margin, "My Little Miracle." The words that had once brought comfort now raised questions. Who had named her Emma? Why had Clara never mentioned the name in any of her notes or letters? Was it possible that the identity she had grown up with was nothing more than a placeholder, something assigned by the very people who had stolen her life away? The uncertainty pulled at something deep inside her. Nathaniel entered quietly, holding a folder. "The lawyers want to speak with you tomorrow morning. They're going to help draft a sworn statement." Emma nodded but didn't look up. He crossed the room and sat in the chair opposite hers. "I know this has been overwhelming. You've handled it with more strength than I thought possible." She closed the journal gently. "What if I'm wrong?" Nathaniel frowned. "About what?" "About everything. About Clara. About being her daughter. What if it's all coincidence? What if I'm just someone who looks like her and stumbled into this house at the right moment?" She looked up. "What if I wanted it to be true so badly that I made myself believe it?" Nathaniel sat forward. "Emma, we found a photograph of Clara holding a newborn. We found a medical record listing her due date, your birthday. We found letters naming you. We found a will. An unnotarized will," she corrected. "Without a birth certificate, without adoption papers, without DNA, none of this can legally prove I'm her daughter." "Not in court." He didn't respond immediately. His silence confirmed what she already suspected. Emma stood and paced the room. Susan knew that. Walter too. That's why they never needed to destroy everything, just enough to cast doubt. And the rest they buried in enough bureaucracy that no one would ever go looking. Nathaniel's voice was quiet. "I believe you. That's not going to change." "But will it matter?" she asked. "In the boardroom? In court?" He didn't lie. "It might not. Not unless we find something more." Emma turned toward the fireplace, eyes on the mantel. There, sitting among polished brass and porcelain pieces, was a framed oil painting of a coastal scene. She stepped closer. At first glance, it was just a landscape, waves, cliffs, a sky turning violet at sunset. But the lower right corner held something she hadn't seen before, faint initials scratched into the paint. E.C. Did Clara sign her paintings with initials? Emma asked suddenly. Nathaniel looked up. Sometimes. But not those. Emma pointed. These aren't hers. They're mine. He stood and walked over. The initials were subtle, easy to miss, but undeniably present. I painted this in high school, Emma said. At the shelter. We had an art therapist who gave us canvas scraps. I painted this from memory. I must have left it behind. Nathaniel stared at her. You're sure? I remember the sky. I remember because it didn't match the ocean, and I got frustrated. Nathaniel reached for the frame and carefully removed it from the wall. On the back, a sticker was affixed, marked with an auction lot number. This was sold at a fundraiser, he said. Years ago. I remember buying it, it reminded me of Clara. I didn't realize. Emma felt the room sway slightly. Someone had taken her artwork. Someone had placed it in that auction. That meant there were still people alive who had handled her file, her belongings, people who might have answers. I need to go back to the shelter, she said. There has to be someone there who remembers me. Someone who can connect me to Clara. Nathaniel hesitated. If you go digging too publicly, Walter will hear about it. Emma's expression hardened. Good. Maybe it's time he started to worry. Later that evening, Emma returned to her room and found a new envelope slipped under the door. No name. No sender. She opened it slowly. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a printed image, a photograph of a young woman in a hospital bed, holding a newborn. The woman's face was bruised, her hair disheveled, but unmistakable. It was Clara. And the baby in her arms was marked with a wristband. Baby girl Elridge. Emma's breath caught. Attached to the photo was a post-it note in sharp handwriting. You want proof? This is a start. Follow the ink. She turned the paper over. On the back, faintly visible, was the imprint of a hospital logo, St. Martha's Clinic, East Boston. Emma grabbed her coat and ran. 20 minutes later, she arrived at the clinic. It was old but still operating. She stepped inside, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the smell of antiseptic sharp and familiar. At the reception desk, a young woman looked up. Can I help you? I'm trying to find information about a patient who gave birth here in August of the year 2000, Emma said. Her name was Clara Elridge. The woman hesitated. That's over 2 decades ago. Emma nodded. Please. I have a copy of a photo. I think someone who worked here helped her. The receptionist stood. Let me call someone. Minutes later, an older nurse appeared. Her eyes were tired, but she carried herself with quiet confidence. I'm Maria, she said. You said Clara Elridge? Emma held up the photograph. Maria stared at it for a long moment. I remember her, she said softly. She was scared. She said someone was trying to take her baby. She begged us not to let anyone in unless she approved it. Emma's voice cracked. Do you know what happened to the baby? Maria nodded slowly. After she gave birth, a man came in with a court order, said he was from the family. He took the child while Clara was still unconscious. Emma's hands trembled. Do you remember his name? Maria looked away. I never saw the papers myself. But the doctor who approved the release was under pressure. He left the clinic a month later. Said he couldn't live with what he'd done. Do you know where he is? Emma asked. Maria paused. I think I do. But if you go to him, be prepared. The truth may not bring you peace. Emma looked at her with quiet resolve. I'm not looking for peace anymore. I'm looking for justice. Emma didn't see it coming. For a brief moment, she believed that the tide had turned, that perhaps the truth was strong enough to break through all the deception. But betrayal, she was learning, was neither rare nor predictable. It struck quietly, from inside walls she thought she was safely behind. It was early morning. The first light of dawn seeped through the windows in Nathaniel's study, casting long shadows on the floor. He was across the room, reviewing documents. Emma sat at a desk nearby, reading through medical records Maria had helped secure. The ink was fresh enough, the lines mostly legible. She traced the names, dates, signatures, her heart beating with hope. Nathaniel looked up. We'll need an expert to authenticate these. Forensic handwriting, hospital logs, everything. Emma nodded, rubbing the bridge of her nose. I want this done properly. If Walter, whoever else, tried to tamper with things, we'll prove it. A knock at the door interrupted them. Nathaniel called, Come in. Susan stepped inside. She was unaccompanied. Her face was composed, controlled, the expression polished into polite concern. Emma froze. She had not expected to see Susan again, and not under these circumstances. Nathaniel stood. Susan. You know Emma now. We were about to begin legal proceedings. Susan's gaze flicked past Emma, then met Nathaniel's. I see, she said. Her voice was even, but there was something in the tilt of her head that betrayed holding back. I'd like to talk, Susan went on. Emma braced, her gut clenched. To explain some things. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. Susan closed the door behind her. For a moment, no one spoke. Then she took a breath. Clara, she asked me once to destroy something, Susan said, eyes fixed somewhere distant. She said if anything happened, if she couldn't raise the child, no one should have evidence to use it. Her hand twisted on her clipboard. She was scared. Emma's heart pounded. So you did it? You destroyed evidence? No, Susan said rapidly. I hid it. Because of Walter. Because her voice broke for the first time. He made threats. Nathaniel frowned. You knew Walter was interfering. Why didn't you warn me? Susan's eyes glistened with something like regret. He held power. Threatened your board. Promised ruin if anyone exposed him. I was protecting the child, protecting Emma. She turned to face Emma. I thought if you never knew, you'd never hurt. Emma's chest tightened with anger. You thought ignorance was protection? Susan looked away. It seemed the only way. A long silence hung in the room. Emma stood still, wanting to believe Susan, but the betrayal pressed in. You left the box under the floorboards, Emma said. You stored letters, photos, all hidden so nobody would find out. But then someone moved the floorboards. Someone tried to bury it again. Susan swallowed. I never intended for Walter to come after you like this. He already has, Emma said. He got Susan to arrange donors to remove things. Ransacked my room. Susan's face tightened. Yes. I warned you to stop, but I also made sure some things were preserved. The painting in the greenhouse. The photograph in the safe. But Walter's reach was deeper than I believed. Nathaniel withdrew a file from his briefcase. He tossed it toward Susan. These documents were notarized last night, he said. Some clauses in Clara's will were upheld despite missing signatures, because the clinic records, the baby photos, and other witnesses were enough for a temporary hearing. If we move today, we can get an injunction. Freeze Walter's assets. Sue for custody and rights. Susan nodded slightly. Yes. But Walter anticipated. He filed a restraining order. Claimed defamation. Claimed I tampered with evidence. At that, Emma felt the world spin. Nathaniel shook his head. Not enough to stand. Our evidence is fresh and strong. He doesn't yet have countersigned affidavits from credible witnesses. Susan's eyes darted to Emma. There's something else. He's destroyed some records. He bribed clinic staff. Some logs are missing, machine logs, phone records. Emma closed her eyes. So, some people in the hospital were paid off? Susan didn't know, Nathaniel said, calm but sorrowful. But he might have. Susan looked at Emma. I helped as much as I could. But I couldn't stop everything. Emma's throat burned. Betrayed by Susan, threatened by Walter, the inherited fear of being erased rose up inside her. Painful, but now it was raw and clear. She stood. Then let's expose him. Susan's lip quivered. Be careful, she said. Emma turned to Nathaniel. Who can testify? Who saw Walter outside the clinic? The doctor who left? Nathaniel nodded and began listing names. Dr. Morgan, who administered discharged paperwork. Maria, the nurse. Linda from the orphanage. He placed his hand over Emma's. We'll gather them. We'll secure statements. We'll go public. Emma inhaled, steadying herself. I want to stand before them. Before the board. Before the state. I want everyone who silenced me to see me. Susan's face was pale. This path will ruin people. But if it's what you want. Emma said nothing. She shut the study door quietly, with Susan still inside, and faced Nathaniel. I'm not doing this for revenge, she said. I'm doing it because I deserve to exist. Nathaniel's eyes glinted. And you will. The following afternoon, Emma prepared herself for an interview with a state attorney. Her hands shook slightly as she reviewed her testimony. The room was furnished plainly, wooden table, leather chairs, a window letting in light. The attorney, a woman with silver hair and sharp glasses, asked questions, details, timelines, motives. Emma recalled Clara's letters, Susan's admission, the hidden box, the hospital testimony. She spoke truth, not as a girl hoping, but as a claimant of her identity. After the session, Emma stepped outside into the courtyard. Rain had returned, drumming on the stone paths. The wind tugged at her coat. Nathaniel joined her silently. For a moment, Emma closed her eyes and let the rain soak her, cold and real. "You were perfect," Nathaniel said quietly. "Brave." Emma opened her eyes. "It still hurts." Nathaniel nodded. "Sometimes the truth is sharp." Emma turned to him. "What if Walter countersued? What if they say I forged everything? We have witnesses. We have experts. We're protected by what we've uncovered." Nathaniel took her hand. "You are not alone." As the rain eased and droplets slid down leaves, Emma felt something she had not in a long time: relief. Not complete. Not safe. But it was hers. The painful blow had landed, but she stood standing. Not erased. Not silenced. Not gone. The day after Emma's interview with the state attorney, the silence in the mansion felt heavier than usual. It wasn't the type of silence that came with peace. It was the quiet of anticipation, of pressure building just before something gave way. Nathaniel had spent most of the morning on calls with his legal team, coordinating witness statements and forwarding documentation. Meanwhile, Emma retreated to the east wing of the house, seeking space to process the storm unfolding around her. As much as she wanted to keep fighting, she needed clarity, and space to breathe. She ended up back in the old study. The one Susan had once used, the one where they had found Clara's letters buried beneath years of dust and secrets. Most of the drawers were empty now, but Emma wasn't there for paperwork. She was searching for patterns, connections. Somewhere between Susan's confession and Walter's legal assault, there had to be something else, something overlooked. She sat behind the desk and began opening drawers again. This time, she focused on details: scraps of paper, old receipts, binder tabs without binders. In the bottom drawer, pushed far behind a stack of yellowing magazines, she found a thin wooden box. It wasn't locked. When she opened it, the contents startled her. Inside was a set of keys and a small, velvet-bound journal. The initials engraved on the cover weren't Clara's, but Emma's. E.C. Emma blinked. She had never seen it before. She opened the first page. "Emma, if this ever finds its way to you, I hope you know I never meant to leave you in darkness. I had to keep you hidden, from them, from everything they stood for. If you want to understand who they are, you must follow what they've covered up. Begin with the Bayview account. Clara never stopped fighting for you. Neither will I." The note wasn't signed. But the handwriting was unmistakable. Emma had seen it in letters from Susan. She turned the pages. Inside were a series of entries, not diary style, but investigative notes, transactions, bank statements, names of organizations, hospital donors. The term Bayview appeared repeatedly. Emma remembered the name. Bayview was the orphanage she had grown up in. But according to Susan's entry, there was also a Bayview Holdings, an offshore account that funded several charities and benevolent projects tied to Walter's corporate investments. Emma stood up and crossed the house quickly to Nathaniel's office. She found him speaking with two men, legal aides. His eyes shifted when he saw her expression. He excused the others and waved her in. "I found something," she said, laying the journal on his desk. Nathaniel read silently. With each turn of the page, his jaw tensed. "This goes beyond the inheritance," he muttered. "Walter wasn't just hiding your existence. He was funneling money through shell foundations and tying them to his influence over Clara's legacy." Emma pointed to one of the entries. "Bayview Holdings funded the very orphanage I was placed in." Nathaniel leaned back. "Which means your placement wasn't random." "He created the conditions for my disappearance," she said. and then used those same institutions to profit. To keep up appearances. Nathaniel closed the journal slowly. If we can trace these accounts, show the manipulation of Clara's estate, the redirected funds, he won't just lose in court. He'll lose everything. Emma sat across from him, the rush of new information making her hands tremble. There's something else. She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded envelope that had been delivered anonymously earlier that morning, this time sealed and stamped with no return address. Inside was a photo. A young woman with short hair and tired eyes, Emma's face, but younger, rougher. A scanned intake form from Bayview Home for Children was attached, this time with a signature at the bottom, Walter Grant, family representative. Nathaniel's voice darkened. He claimed he never saw you. That the child had died with Clara. And yet here's his signature. Nathaniel reached for the phone immediately. We need this verified. This is the crack in the wall. We break this open, and the entire structure collapses. While his team began examining the journal and matching signatures, Emma took the opportunity to contact Linda, the elderly orphanage administrator who had first hinted at Walter's interference. Linda agreed to meet her privately. They chose a quiet diner outside of Boston. Emma sat in the corner booth, fingers laced around a coffee cup, watching the door until Linda arrived, coat buttoned up to her neck, eyes alert but weary. I didn't expect to hear from you again, Linda said as she slid into the booth. Emma leaned forward. I found the journal. It mentions Bayview Holdings. And Walter. And you. Linda nodded slowly. I suppose I always knew someone would start asking the right questions one day. Did Walter pay you? Linda flinched, but didn't deny it. He paid the home, not me. But the money came with conditions: keep your mouth shut, keep the records closed, and don't ask what happened before they arrived. They? Emma asked. Linda hesitated. Walter didn't act alone. He had legal guardianship arranged for you under a false name, placed through one of the holding accounts. But the placement never happened. The paperwork disappeared after the child, you, were processed. Emma narrowed her eyes. What do you mean it never happened? I mean, Linda said, voice soft, that someone else came before the official guardian did. A woman. She claimed to be Clara's cousin. She used fake ID, but she looked exactly like her. She took you. And a week later, Walter came with his court papers, furious. Emma's stomach turned. Are you saying someone else took me first? Yes. And Walter spent months trying to recover you. But you vanished into the system. Bounced between shelters, homes, until no one could trace the origin anymore. Emma was silent for a long time. If that woman hadn't taken her, if Walter had gotten to her first, there might not have been anything left of her history. Nothing at all. Back at the mansion, Emma and Nathaniel reviewed the recording of Linda's statement. They added it to the file they would present to the court and the press. She saved you, Nathaniel said. Whoever she was. Emma nodded. And Walter's entire case just collapsed under its own weight. Nathaniel gave her a rare smile. Then let's make sure the rest of the world hears it too. It was just past noon when Nathaniel received the message that made the silence in the room collapse into something far heavier. A curt, formal email from the office of Walter Grant's legal counsel. No further negotiation will be entertained. Consider this the final warning before litigation. Nathaniel read it aloud in his office, his voice steady but cold. Emma stood near the tall window, arms crossed as she looked out across the rain-slicked garden. She didn't flinch at the threat. Not anymore. The time for fear had passed. They know we're close, she said. Nathaniel nodded. Too close. Which means they'll do everything to shut it down before it becomes public. I want the world to hear Clara's voice, Emma said. And mine. He met her gaze. Then we need to prepare for a war. What followed was a series of days marked by precision and tension. Nathaniel's legal team moved swiftly, filing formal motions to request an injunction that would block Walter from accessing any more of Clara's estate or redirecting funds from Bayview Holdings. Witnesses were interviewed on record. Linda's sworn statement was added to the formal dossier, along with the image of Walter's signature on the orphanage intake form. But what they still lacked, the final, undeniable blow, was Clara's voice itself. A letter, a video, something in her own words that proved beyond dispute that she had fought to protect Emma and that Walter had silenced her. That proof came from an unexpected place. It was the housekeeper, Martha, who approached Emma late one night in the hallway. "I've been here 22 years, she said without preamble. And I've kept my mouth shut. Because Susan told me it was safer that way." Emma stared at her, unsure of what to say. "But I remember the day Clara left," Martha continued. "She gave me something. Told me to keep it until someone came asking." "Why didn't you say anything before?" Emma asked. Martha didn't blink. "Because no one asked." She handed Emma a small cassette tape in a white envelope, yellowed with age. Emma's fingers trembled as she opened it. There was a single line written across the front in faded ink, "In case they bury me too." Emma took the tape to Nathaniel immediately. He had an old player in his archives room, one of the few still working. They inserted the tape and waited as it crackled to life. Then Clara's voice filled the room. It wasn't a performance. It was raw, breathless, the sound of someone speaking in desperation, not knowing if her words would ever be heard. "Nate, if you're hearing this, it means something's happened to me. And if Emma's with you, my Emma, then maybe I did something right after all. I didn't want to disappear, but Walters made it clear he'll stop at nothing to keep this from coming to light. He says it's for the company, for the shareholders. But I know it's about power. About control. He thinks if he buries me, he buries everything. Please, protect her. If she ever finds her way back to you, believe her. Believe in us." Emma wiped a tear from her cheek as the tape clicked to an end. Clara's voice vanished, but the impact remained. Nathaniel turned slowly. This is it. The silenced truth. Clara's own testimony. The next day, they filed the tape as part of a formal evidentiary package. Legal analysts who reviewed the submission said it was potentially devastating for Walter's defense. It confirmed motive. It connected the timeline. And it humanized Clara's story in a way no document could. Word spread quickly across the boardrooms and back offices of the companies Walter still controlled. Shareholders began calling emergency meetings. A group of trustees resigned. And Nathaniel received an anonymous tip. Walter had been quietly selling assets abroad in anticipation of an imminent legal collapse. That night, as tension rippled across the city's corporate circles, Emma received another envelope. This one was hand-delivered and left on her pillow. Inside was a single photo, Clara again, but this time with Walter, standing beside a car. She looked exhausted. He looked angry. On the back, in pen, was a date, June 14, 2000. And one line, the last day she was seen alive by anyone except him. Emma stared at the photo for a long time. Walter had claimed for years that Clara died in a car accident while traveling alone. But now, for the first time, she saw that he had been with her shortly before she vanished. She brought the photo to Nathaniel immediately. He lied about being with her that day, Emma said. This changes everything. Nathaniel took a moment, then said, "We need to subpoena his travel records. See if he was really where he claimed." The next morning, they met with a federal investigator who had agreed to open an inquiry into Clara's death. With the tape, the photo, and the newly submitted testimony from the clinic's former doctor, who finally agreed to come forward, they had a foundation strong enough to reclassify Clara's death as suspicious. The press got wind of it by noon. That evening, as the media scrambled for statements and Walter's attorneys declined to comment, Emma stood on the back patio of the mansion, watching the lights of the city flicker in the distance. Nathaniel joined her in silence. She knew, Emma said softly. Clara. She knew he was going to make her disappear. Nathaniel placed a hand on her shoulder. And now the world knows too. Emma didn't speak for a while. She felt the weight of everything they had uncovered, the fragile thread between grief and justice. But more than anything, she felt something beginning to shift. For the first time in her life, she wasn't invisible. The truth was no longer buried. And neither was she. The formal investigation into Clara's death had been opened less than a week, but already the pressure surrounding Walter Grant had begun to fracture his once immovable empire. The shareholders of his company demanded an emergency board meeting, and the press followed every legal update with growing intensity. Emma found herself at the center of something much larger than a personal battle. It had become a national scandal. Yet just as the momentum seemed irreversible, the narrative shifted. It began with a leak. Early that morning, Nathaniel's phone buzzed with a notification from a major media outlet. A headline spread across his screen: "Anonymous source claims inconsistencies in Clara Elridge's will, alleged alterations and questionable timeline." Emma read the article twice. Then again. And again. According to the report, a new witness, an unnamed former employee of a private legal firm, claimed that Clara's will had been amended weeks after her official date of death. The implication was clear: someone had forged changes to the document after Clara was already gone. And because those amendments formed part of Emma's case, the entire foundation was now under scrutiny. "They're trying to turn the story around," Nathaniel said, his voice dark. "They want to cast doubt not just on your past, but on Clara herself." Emma clenched her jaw. "They want to make it look like we're the liars." He nodded. "And they're doing it with enough precision that it could stall the investigation." That same day, their legal team received notice from the court. Walter Grant's lawyers had filed a motion to pause all proceedings, citing potential fraud and manufactured evidence by Nathaniel and Emma. They even submitted a list of supposed inconsistencies found in Clara's handwriting, trying to cast suspicion on the letters and the audio tape. But the most shocking claim came in the final paragraph of their submission. Walter now alleged that Clara had been mentally unstable in her final year. That her fears were delusional. That she had fabricated threats from Walter as part of a paranoid spiral, and that her supposed letters and recordings were merely reflections of a deteriorating mind, not a cry for help. Emma stared at the papers in disbelief. "They're trying to frame her as unstable?" she asked, her voice shaking. "That's their strategy now?" "It's more than strategy," Nathaniel said, closing the file. "It's a full-blown counteroffensive. They want to destroy her credibility so completely that anything tied to her, especially you, is dismissed without question." The impact was immediate. News outlets ran segments on the will forgery theory. Online forums speculated whether Emma was a con artist seeking a fortune. A former board member, long retired and clearly loyal to Walter, gave an interview suggesting Clara had been emotional and impulsive in her final months. Emma's world began to tilt again. "I knew this would be hard," she said to Nathaniel later that night. "But I didn't expect them to rewrite her." Nathaniel looked at her with quiet resolve. "Let them write what they want. We'll write the truth louder." But then came the real twist, one that no one saw coming. The next morning, as Emma prepared to head to a follow-up meeting with the federal investigator, her phone rang. It was Linda, the retired orphanage worker who had given her the key testimony about her childhood placement. Linda's voice was trembling. "Emma, you need to come now. Someone's broken into my house." Emma was already grabbing her coat. "Are you okay?" "I wasn't here. But they took the files. The photo. Everything." Nathaniel drove her there in silence. When they arrived, the back door had been forced open and several cabinets emptied. Linda stood on the porch with a police officer, arms folded tightly around herself. She didn't speak until the officer left. "I made backups," she said finally. But whoever this was, they weren't just looking for documents. She handed Emma a small flash drive. "I saved something else," Linda whispered. "A voicemail. From years ago. I never knew what it meant until now." Emma took it back to the estate. Nathaniel helped pull the audio file onto his computer. A woman's voice came through, distorted slightly by time and technology, but recognizable. Clara. If they come for the baby early, go to Bayview. Use the secondary name. Don't let them register her under Elridge. Walter's watching. He'll trace it. Emma's heart stopped. She rewound it. Played it again. Use the secondary name. Nathaniel leaned forward. What secondary name? Emma scrolled through the old Bayview orphanage records. One entry caught her eye, dated 1 week after Clara's death. A child placed under a different name entirely. Emily Shore. I know that name, Emma whispered. That's what was on my first foster papers. I thought it was a typo. Nathaniel's eyes widened. She gave you a false name, to protect you from being found. Emma sat back in her chair, mind spinning. That means there might be more identities, more records under that alias. And they were right. A deep search revealed 2 clinic visits filed under the name Emily Shore, both at a women's shelter in a different part of the state. Emma never remembered being there, but the dates aligned. One of the intake logs mentioned a social worker named Rebecca Holloway. It took Nathaniel's team less than 12 hours to track Rebecca down. She was retired, living in a quiet town outside of Worcester. When they called, she agreed to meet. The next day, Emma and Nathaniel sat across from her in a sunlit kitchen. I remember the child, Rebecca said. Quiet. Dark hair. Always clutching a silver locket. Said her mother gave it to her. Emma reached into her pocket and held up the same locket. Rebecca's face changed. She told me her name was Emma, the woman said, slowly. She whispered it. Said not to call her Emily. Said her real name was Emma. Tears filled Emma's eyes. She remembered. Rebecca nodded. I knew she was hiding something. But I didn't know from who. Or why. Emma held her breath. Do you still have any of your logs? Rebecca stood and opened a drawer, pulling out an old leather-bound notebook. She flipped through it and pointed to an entry. Emma. Brought in under alias Emily Shore. Arrived with minimal paperwork. Placed on temporary hold until referred to Bayview Home. Nathaniel snapped a photo of the page immediately. This was it. Not just an alias, but documented evidence of Clara's plan. A plan to hide Emma under a different name, to protect her from Walter, and perhaps from anyone who might have tried to take her again. Emma stood from the table, her voice clear. They can spin lies. They can call her unstable. But every time they do, we'll answer with truth. And this time, she had the evidence to prove it. The courtroom was colder than Emma expected. Not physically, the room itself was temperate, with high windows that let in filtered morning light and long oak benches polished to a dull shine. But there was something in the air, something stiff and calculated, the kind of chill that came from a room where truth had to fight to be heard. She sat at the table beside Nathaniel, her hands folded, wrists tense. Before them, a panel of 3 civil court judges prepared to hear the latest filings, a response to Walter Grant's attempt to invalidate Clara's estate decisions and undermine Emma's claim of lineage. This wasn't the trial yet. That would come later. But it was a critical step. If the panel ruled in their favor, Emma's legal standing as Clara's daughter would be formally recognized, and the weight of evidence against Walter would become impossible to dismiss. The judges entered. The clerk called the session to order. Emma didn't hear much of the opening arguments. Her mind wandered, to Clara's voice on the tape, to the locket in her pocket, to the image of her mother's signature on the hospital record. Then she thought of Walter, watching from the other table, his expression blank, mask firmly in place. But beneath it, she saw the cracks. The tightening of his jaw. The way he gripped the edge of the table a second too long after each objection. For the first time, Walter wasn't in control. When Emma was called to speak, she stood slowly, walked to the center, and took the oath. Her voice was low at first, steady but quiet. My name is Emma Collins, she began. But for most of my life, I didn't know who I was. I thought I had been abandoned. Forgotten. I thought maybe I wasn't supposed to exist. She paused, then looked at the judges directly. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was buried under years of silence, forged documents, sealed files, and people in power who decided that I didn't matter. That my mother didn't matter. That her fear, her love, and her legacy could be erased. She reached into her coat and placed the locket on the table. This belonged to Clara. She gave it to me. I wore it when I was taken in under a false name. When I was passed from one home to another. It's the only thing I kept. The only thing that reminded me I came from someone who cared. Her voice did not waver. They said she was unstable. They said she was paranoid. But what mother wouldn't be, when the man who claimed to protect her was the same man trying to take her child away for his own benefit? She glanced at Walter but didn't linger. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because I want the truth to be honored. Because I want her voice to be heard. And because I don't believe silence should win. The courtroom remained still as she stepped down. After her, the judges heard from Linda, from Rebecca Holloway, and from the forensic analyst who verified the documents and Clara's voice recording. Piece by piece, the puzzle was laid before the court. And this time, the image was undeniable. The panel adjourned for deliberation. 2 hours later, they returned with a statement that echoed through the quiet room like thunder. The court finds sufficient evidence to recognize Emma Collins as the biological daughter of Clara Margaret Elridge and to validate the submitted documents as reflective of Clara Elridge's intentions prior to her death. Walter Grant's motion to dismiss is hereby denied. Emma let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Walter did not look at her. He stood, whispered something to his lawyer, and exited the courtroom without a backward glance. Outside, the press waited. Flashbulbs popped. Reporters shouted questions. But Emma didn't stop. She walked past them, beside Nathaniel, toward the black car waiting by the curb. Only when the door shut behind her did she speak. So what happens now? Nathaniel turned to her. Now the real trial begins. Criminal charges. Corporate fraud. Everything we've uncovered will be used to build the final case. But today, you won. Emma nodded. It didn't feel like victory, not exactly. It felt like justice catching its breath before continuing to run. Back at the mansion, the staff seemed lighter, the air somehow less heavy. For the first time, Emma wasn't treated as a guest or a stranger. She was greeted with quiet nods, with respect. Not because of Nathaniel, not because of money, but because of truth. That evening, Nathaniel called her to the study. He held a folder in his hands. Inside it were Clara's foundation papers, documents for the nonprofit Clara had once started but which had been dissolved after her death. She wanted this to help people like you, Nathaniel said. Young women without a voice. Without safety. Without guidance. I want to restart it. But not as the figurehead. Not as the donor. Emma looked at him. I want you to run it, he said. As Clara's daughter. As someone who knows what it means to be unheard. Emma said nothing for a long moment. I don't know how to run a foundation. You'll learn. I'll help. But this should be yours. You've earned it. She stared down at the folder. So much had changed. Weeks ago, she was asking for food. Now she was being offered a legacy. A place. A purpose. And yet, she hesitated. Is this what Clara would have wanted? She asked. Nathaniel's voice softened. I think she would have wanted you to choose. Whatever you decide. Emma walked to the window, the garden below glowing in the warm light of dusk. She thought of the shelter, of the young girls still out there, still wandering, still wondering who they were. She thought of herself, not just the child who was hidden, but the woman who was found. Then she turned back. I'll do it, she said. But not because it's owed to me. Because someone else will need it, just like I did. Nathaniel smiled. Then let's begin. 3 months had passed since the court recognized Emma as Clara Elridge's daughter. In that time, the name Emma Collins had shifted from a whispered mystery in high society to a symbol of quiet resilience, covered by the press and followed by legal analysts as the case against Walter Grant moved toward trial. But Emma had never been interested in becoming a symbol. She had always wanted only one thing: to understand where she came from. Now that she did, it was time to decide what kind of future she would build with the truth in hand. The newly revived Clara Foundation had opened its doors that week in the heart of Boston. A modest building, 4 stories of red brick and wide windows, had been repurposed into a space where young women could find shelter, resources, and something rarer, someone who believed them. Emma stood in the foyer that morning, watching as staff organized supplies and volunteers welcomed their first group of residents. There was a quiet satisfaction in the way the place came alive, not with formality or fanfare, but with warmth. The kind Clara might have created if she'd lived to see it through. Nathaniel arrived around noon, carrying a sealed envelope and 2 coffees. He handed one to Emma without a word and joined her at the window that overlooked the front garden. The 2 of them stood there for a while, sipping in silence. "Letters arrived today," he said finally. "From the foundation?" "No," he said, holding up the envelope. "From the state attorney's office." Emma turned to face him. "They've reviewed all the evidence," he continued. "Walter's trial is moving forward. Grand jury proceedings begin in 2 weeks." Emma took the envelope and opened it carefully. Inside was the official statement: Walter Grant would be tried on charges including fraud, obstruction of justice, and unlawful concealment of identity. The trial would be high profile, his company's board had already distanced themselves, and stockholders had begun liquidating. The man who once held Clara's fate in his hands would now be judged by the world. Emma set the letter aside. "I thought I'd feel something more," she admitted. "Relief. Closure." Nathaniel nodded. "Sometimes justice isn't loud. Sometimes it's just the absence of fear." She smiled faintly. Later that day, Emma walked through the foundation building, passing an empty office on the 2nd floor that had once belonged to Clara. It had been left mostly untouched, some of her paintings now lined the walls, and her desk had been restored with care. But one drawer remained locked until that morning. Inside was a bundle wrapped in linen, labeled with Clara's initials. Emma unfolded it slowly. Inside were 6 handwritten letters, each addressed to a different person. One was marked, "To her, if she ever finds me." Emma opened it. "My dearest Emma," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then the world did not succeed in taking you from me forever. I have imagined your face 1,000 times, even though I only saw it for a few hours. You were perfect. And I never stopped loving you, not for a single heartbeat." Emma sat down. "I left behind this foundation because I knew I might not survive long enough to build it myself. But maybe you will. Maybe, in ways I can't even imagine, you'll take the pieces of me they tried to bury and turn them into something whole. And maybe you'll find him, Nate. If you do, tell him I never stopped trusting him. Not even when it hurt." Her hands trembled as she continued. "You are my miracle. I hope you never let anyone tell you otherwise. And if this world has been cruel to you, I hope you forgive it, not because it deserves your forgiveness, but because you deserve to be free from its weight." At the bottom of the page, a date. The same week Clara had disappeared. Emma folded the letter slowly and pressed it to her chest. The next day, she made a decision. She called a meeting with the foundation staff and announced a new initiative, a mobile outreach unit that would bring resources directly to shelters and encampments around the state. It would bear Clara's name, and its first mission would be to visit the same neighborhoods where Emma herself had once walked, cold and hungry, with only a backpack and a fading hope. By the following week, Emma stood on the steps of the courthouse as the trial against Walter Grant began inside. She wasn't called to testify that day. She didn't need to be. Her presence was enough. Journalists asked for quotes. She declined. Someone asked, "What would your mother say today if she were here?" Emma answered quietly, "She'd probably tell me to stop wasting time talking and get back to work." The trial took weeks. Walter's defense crumbled steadily under the weight of documents, voice recordings, and sworn testimonies. He never apologized. Not once. But in the end, it didn't matter. The verdict was delivered without hesitation, guilty on all counts. As the sentence was read, Emma didn't look at him. She looked straight ahead, steady and calm. That night, she returned to the mansion one last time. Nathaniel was waiting on the porch. "You don't have to leave," he said. "I know," Emma replied. "But I need to go. The foundation is my home now." He smiled, but there was a hint of sadness in it. "You remind me of her. More every day." Emma stepped forward and hugged him. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't forced. It simply was. "Thank you," she said. "For believing me." "You made it easy," he replied. She would have been proud. Emma turned, climbed into the car, and drove away from the mansion, not because she was running, but because she had finally arrived at herself. The streets of Boston blurred past the windows, but her thoughts were clear. She wasn't just the girl who had asked to clean for a plate of food. She was the woman who had reclaimed her voice, her mother's name, and her right to exist. And that story, her story, was only just beginning.